Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jenny Eastwood and thank you for being patient with me. I know it's been quite a while since I released a video, but I mean, there's a few reasons for that. One is I've recently started a new job, so I don't have quite the same amount of flexibility that I had before when I was pumping out videos every week. So now I'm posting every 2 weeks if I can. Hopefully I'll be able to get back up to every week. That is the goal. We'll see how we go. I don't want to create crappy videos because I'm just trying to rush to put them out there. So I would rather take a bit longer to post something and have it actually be good and something I'm proud of than, you know, just posting for the sake of posting. So I hope that you enjoyed today's case, which is quite an interesting one, and it is the story of Minnie Dean. And if you're a Kiwi, you've probably heard of this case before. If not, Minnie Dean has become kind of one of New Zealand's most infamous figures, and there have been like legends told around the case of Minnie Dean. This was a story that happened in the 1800s, in the 1890s specifically, and she is the only woman, the first and only woman to be executed in New Zealand's history. So before we carry on, I just want to give a quick warning that today's story does deal with the topic of infanticide. So if that is something that you are wary of, please, you know, click away now, and I'm sure I'll see you in another video with some story that's a little bit more appropriate for you. Anyway, let's crack on with this case. So for years and years, Minnie Dean has been portrayed as this cold-blooded killer who murdered babies for cash. And in fact, she earned herself the title of the Southland Witch here in New Zealand. And it has become a larger-than-life story, I suppose, this idea of who Minnie was. According to folklore, Minnie Dean would murder little babies with hat pins and dispose of their bodies in streams. Parents used to threaten that if you misbehaved, they'd send you to Minnie Dean, that if you were naughty, she was coming to get you. So she's like, I suppose, the New Zealand boogeyman, I guess. So, Minnie Dean was born Wilhelmina McCulloch on the 2nd of December 1844 at West Greenock, Renfrewshire in Scotland. Minnie was the fourth in a family of 8 girls born to her mother Elizabeth Swan and to her father John McCulloch, who was an engine driver with the Glasgow, Paisley and Greenock Railway. Minnie's mother Elizabeth died of cancer in 1857, although it's unconfirmed which kind of cancer, and unfortunately there is very little known about Minnie's life prior to her arrival in New Zealand. So we don't really know anything about where she grew up, what her siblings are doing, or anything like that. We also don't really know the circumstances around which she arrived, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Minnie Dean arrived in Invercargill on a ship from Tasmania in the early 1860s. Now, I did read conflicting information about when she arrived. One source said that it was 1868, but then every other source I've read, including very reputable news outlets, say that it's actually unknown what the specific year was, and she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. At the time she arrived, Minnie had one young daughter and she was pregnant with another. She told people that she was the widow of an Australian doctor and the daughter of a Presbyterian minister back home in Scotland. However, there is pretty much no evidence to support her story. There is no marriage certificate, and she continued to go by her maiden name. So if she really was a widow, it does beg the question why she would do that. However, it was not uncommon in the 1800s for migrants to reinvent themselves, especially if they had a controversial background. It was basically like a brand new opportunity to start fresh and pretty much create the life that you want and make people believe what you want about them. In Minnie's case, Tasmanian birth records for Minnie's eldest daughter show that it was signed with her maiden name, Wilhelmina McCulloch. This suggests that both of Minnie's daughters, Ellen and Isabel, were illegitimate. Linley Hood, the author of Minnie Dean's biography called Minnie Dean, Her Life and Crimes, suggests that because she was only 16 when she arrived in Tasmania, it could have been that she'd gotten pregnant at a very young age and had been sent to the colonies because she was bringing shame upon the family. And obviously in the 19th century, having a child out of wedlock or an illegitimate child was life-ruining for women. Unwed mothers struggled to find jobs, They were looked down upon socially, they couldn't find a husband, and basically they couldn't have any kind of normal social life. So obviously it makes sense that if Minnie came to New Zealand and she had an opportunity to spin another tale that would paint her in a slightly different light, she absolutely would, and I feel like we all would, you know? Now when Minnie arrived in Invercargill, she did have an existing connection. Her aunt, Christine Kelly, or as she referred to her as Granny Kelly, was kind of quite famous actually in the Southland area. She was a founding settler of the Invercargill and Otago area. Granny Kelly helped Minnie get set up on her feet when she first arrived, and people suggest that she probably knew the truth about Minnie's children, but she did her part to perpetuate this new story that Minnie had put together about being a widow, just to make sure that her niece would have a bit of a chance at like living a normal life. So now Minnie had a fresh start. She made a living by teaching, and by all accounts, people thought she was kind and friendly and caring. On June 19th, 1872, she married Charles Dean, an innkeeper formerly of Tasmania, at his home in Ettal Creek. Charles was not a strong personality, and there is not a lot documented or known about him. Apparently he disapproved of Minnie's activities, but was either unwilling or unable to stop them, as would come out later on. And although it seemed like Minnie and Charles had everything going for them, they had, you know, a nice sort of start to life, it seemed that this couple was just cursed with the worst possible luck imaginable. You would not believe the series of horrific events that these two experienced together. So in the 1860s, New Zealand was experiencing its biggest gold rush ever. The Central Otago Gold Rush led to a massive influx of foreign miners flocking to the area. And Minnie and Charles had their hotel in Ettal Creek, which was a stop along the way towards the gold mine. It was a 4-day journey from Riverton to the Central Otago goldfields, so people would stop and have refreshments, they'd stay, and it seemed like they were set to make a pile of money doing this. Minnie's 2 daughters, Ellen and Isabel, both grew up, they got married and moved out of home, but the couple still wanted more children, so they adopted 2 more, Margaret and Esther. And although things were looking really good for them, that's when things took a very sharp turn for the worse. Sadly for the Deans, by 1872, the gold rush was over, and a railway line was built bypassing the Deans pub, so nobody had any reason to visit anymore. Customers dried up, and to make matters worse, New Zealand was right in the middle of what is known as the Long Depression. The bank foreclosed on the mortgage that Charles had taken out to buy the pub, and he was declared bankrupt. So Minnie and Charles turned to Granny Kelly for a bit of help and support to get them out of this tricky situation. She lent the couple enough money to buy a very nice home actually at a place called The Larches, which was just outside of Winton. The Larches was a 2-storied, 7 or 8 room home on 22 acres of land about a mile out of town. They stocked the land with cattle and they planted an orchard, and it seemed like things were looking up for the two, until disaster struck a second time. Sadly, not long after moving into their beautiful new home, the Larches burnt to the ground. Now, it's actually not known what the cause of the fire was. Again, looking into all the details of the story, there are a few little gaps, but either way, the place was just completely destroyed. In addition to that, they owed money to a man who came and took all of their fruit trees as a form of payment. So that was the orchard work just gone. And Minnie and Charles managed to scrape together enough money to rebuild a home, but it was not much better than a hovel. On the site, Charles built a 2-roomed cottage with a lean-to. And it had like dirt floors and stuff, and was just nothing compared to the beautiful home that they had originally purchased. And then, but wait, there's more. They were hit with a third terrible tragedy. Minnie's eldest daughter Ellen and her 2 children, who were 10 months old and 2 years old, sadly were found drowned in a well in their backyard. And it seems that the deaths were a murder-suicide, and that poor Ellen was probably suffering from postpartum depression, but officially it was recorded as an unexplained death. Linley Hood, the author of Minnie's biography thinks that it's probably because the community wanted to make sure that Ellen got a Christian burial, which wouldn't have been possible if the cause of death had been ruled a suicide. So now this takes us to Minnie's current situation. It's the 1880s. She's recently bereaved, having suffered such an incredibly terrible loss. You can't even imagine what that must have felt like. She was living in a hovel, she had no real source of income, things were looking bleak. And don't forget, they had adopted 2 other children at this time as well, so they had 2 mouths to feed too. Because Charles had been declared bankrupt, it made it pretty much impossible for him to find any source of work. So he began raising pigs on some of their land. Minnie had been teaching a bit here and there, but with few options available, she turned to taking in unwanted babies for payment. Now, the options for unmarried girls and women who fell pregnant in Victorian New Zealand were just terrible. Obviously, effective contraception was not available, and women were forced to go to extreme measures to deal with the situation. Some women risked their lives by seeking out an illegal abortionist. Others would conceal their pregnancy, which at the time was also a crime, and then they would commit infanticide. Some women ended up in rescue homes, and then others were willing to pay someone to take their child and raise it as their own. Because I believe at the time you couldn't go through any kind of public adoption process if you were an unwed mother with an illegitimate child. And so it was during this time that the industry of what is called baby farming sprang up. Baby farming was the business of people taking in unwanted children from women who couldn't care for them and raising them as their own in exchange for money. This was not a new thing exclusive to New Zealand. This was happening all around the world at that time. And in the case of Minnie Dean, part of the reason why it became such a big deal is that there were stories coming out of the UK, out of Canada, out of Australia, of horrific baby farming places where children were being brutally murdered. And here's what's even more insane, right, is that the idea of providing any kind of support or payment to these women who were pregnant with illegitimate children and they actually wanted to keep them, that was just like completely out of the question, right? It was considered preposterous, and people thought that in doing so you would just be encouraging more immoral behavior. So obviously Minnie Dean did not lack customers. There was not at the time, like, not a ton of women doing this because it was kind of quite frowned upon, especially with what was happening around the world at the time. New Zealand were getting all these reports of it, so the police were kind of like hawk-eyed, you know, keeping an eye out for any illegal activity. So Minnie would take out ads in the local paper saying she was a respectable married woman living in a country home looking to adopt an infant. Some were taken in for 5 cents to 8 cents a week. Others were paid for with lump sums of like £5, £10, etc. And here's the thing. Minnie definitely did not have the means or resources to be looking after so many children, even with the payment from the mothers. The payment she was receiving was very small at the time, and she was looking after sometimes up to 9 or 10 children under the age of 5 all at once. So in her tiny little 2-bedroom shack, basically. And at the time in New Zealand, infant mortality was a massive problem anyway, right? It's estimated that between 80 to 100 of every 1,000 births resulted in death. And this was for many reasons, obviously, but hygiene was a major factor, and lack of resources and care. If you're not familiar with New Zealand, Invercargill is absolutely freezing. It's so cold. So back then, it honestly was probably like living in a treehouse in a super freezing cold part of the country. So obviously with like up to 9 infants and toddlers living at the Larches at any one time, it is a kind of not surprising that some would die, whether through malnourishment or illness or infection or neglect. It was kind of inevitable, right? So in October of 1889, a 6-month-old infant died of convulsions after a 3-day illness. In March of 1891, another 6-month-old baby died of inflammation of the heart valves and congestion of the lungs. And actually, as sad as it is to say, that's actually not a bad track record when you consider the time period that this was happening. Especially because some of these babies were so young, even newborns. Survival odds for a newborn baby without breast milk were very slim at the best of times, especially because other sorts of milk were at a high risk for contamination and there was no such thing as formula back in the 19th century. In 1891, an inquest was held into the death of one of the infants that was in Minnie's care. This was 6-week-old Bertha Curry. The inquest found that Bertha was actually well nourished and had been well cared for, although the inquest did criticise the state of the house and said that Minnie needed to have fewer children in her care at one time because it was just not practical to have that many children. And at the time of Bertha's death, Minnie had 10 children living with her at the Larches. These children ranged in age from 6 weeks old to 11 years old. And you might be wondering, well, where do 10 children stay in a 2-bedroom hovel with a dirt floor? And let me tell you, 3 slept in bed with Minnie, 4 slept in boxes around the room, 2 slept with Charles in a bed in the lean-to, and 2 shared a bed in the kitchen. However, despite the crowding of the house and the shabbiness of the house, the children were actually well fed and well cared for. It seemed that Minnie genuinely did really care for these children. So, even though the inquest had technically exonerated Minnie for being responsible for Bertha's death, the fact that this inquest had been made public and published in the newspaper just absolutely destroyed Minnie's reputation. And it also meant that moving forward, whenever Minnie had a sick child in her care or one died, she was a lot more reluctant to come forward and be truthful about it for fear that she would be besmirched across the newspapers again. And of course, the inquest provoked community outrage, and this was only inflamed by another death 6 weeks later. In the public's imagination, Minnie Dean had become linked with baby farmers in Britain and Australia who had been convicted of murdering children for financial gain. So it was like this mob mentality where people were really determined for something to be true and would kind of find evidence to point to that, even if it wasn't. You know what I mean? So no more deaths were reported under Minnie's care, but rumors began to fly about children mysteriously disappearing. And here's the thing, at the time, rules around registering and reporting children that you took in to foster or care for were super duper lax, so there's actually no record of, specifically how many children she had or what happened to them or anything like that. So these disappearances are unconfirmed. Nobody knows for sure if this is true or whether there were more or anything like that. But the police were deeply suspicious of Minnie. They began to keep her under surveillance, and of course the community was super wary of her as well. And the police kept coming up against a brick wall because at the time, the laws around child welfare kind of were non-existent, so they had no legal right to enter and search the property. And also, Minnie was not required by law to keep any records or answer any of their questions. However, I did learn that there was some evidence to suggest that Minnie had started taking out life insurance policies on some of the children, which is, as we know, suspicious. Now, the Infant Life Protection Act was introduced in 1893 to monitor baby farming. And this new law required those in the industry to register themselves and the children in their care. Now, Minnie never did apply for registration, believing probably rightly that she would be denied. And in spite of the scrutiny, Minnie continued to bring in new children under her care, but she became increasingly more and more secretive in her attempts to do so. Most of her dealings with parents were carried out under assumed names. She used fake names in her ads and was a little more careful about where she placed them and how she worded them. And when a boy died in her care in 1894, which she later claimed was due to drowning, and we will discuss that more in a little bit, she buried him in her garden to avoid drawing more attention to her. Now, it seemed like the public and the police were constantly on Minnie's tail, looking for any reason at all to bring her in or remove children from her care. And in August 1893, the proprietor of a Christchurch boarding house called the police when he said that Minnie had acquired a 3-week-old baby during her stay with him. And the detective concerned had absolutely no hesitation in removing the child from Minnie's care. And he said, quote, "I believe this woman would have killed or abandoned this child before she got to Dunedin if it had not been taken from her," unquote. And now here's where things really come to a head, and the legend of Minnie Dean as we know it today really sort of was born. So in 1895, the police finally had something. On May the 2nd, 1895, Minnie Dean boarded a train on her way to pick up 2 babies. She visited Bluff first, where she picked up Dorothy Edith Carter. Now on this trip, Minnie was under a lot more stress than usual. Not only was she on a super tight schedule because she had to pick up the second child the next morning from Melbourne, but additionally the police and the community were watching her like a hawk. And on this train ride, there were usuals that she would see all the time who knew who she was and were keeping their eye on her in case of anything suspicious. And to heighten her stress, because she'd become known to the regular travellers on the train and she knew that they would be watching her, if she had a crying infant with her, that would only have drawn more attention. So in any case, when she was in Bluff, Minnie Dean purchased some laudanum. She administered it to Dorothy and carried on with the train trip. Now, depending on who you believe, she did this either to keep her quiet and relaxed on the train journey, calm her fretting and to help her sleep, or to give her a lethal overdose and kill her. And you might be thinking, well, what the heck was she doing giving her laudanum anyway? Well, laudanum was used to soothe infants quite regularly in the 19th century. And as it turns out, it's a very strong opiate. And even though it was known to be dangerous at the time, it was still very common and normal to use it to help soothe infants. I tell you what, the 1900s were wild. So sadly, whatever the intention was behind Minnie's actions, Dorothy unfortunately died on the train. And here is where the most infamous scene takes place that we have come to know about Minnie Dean. She hid Dorothy's little body inside her tin hat box and continued on her way to meet the woman who she would collect little Eva Hornsby from. Now, in a 53-page statement written by Minnie Dean while she was awaiting trial, Minnie stated that, quote, "When I got on the train, I laid the child down on the cushions. She was asleep," unquote. She then said that as she had boarded the evening train, she had given Dorothy some laudanum to help her sleep and relax, but she had misjudged the dose. And here is something quite interesting to note. The laudanum that Minnie had at home, that she often used on the children under her care, turned out to be a very, very dilute solution. So it is possible that Minnie had given the girl the amount that she thought was normal, which actually was a massive, massive overdose because the one she'd been using at home was a lot more dilute. Minnie said that later on the journey, she looked down and realized that the child was dead. She said she panicked. She knew that she was under scrutiny, so she picked little Dorothy up and put her in her tin hat box until she figured out what to do next. The next morning, she set off for the railway station with her tin hat box, her purse, and a parcel as if nothing had happened. Now, when she collected little Eva Hornsby, the poor girl was only in her care for about 10 minutes. And then after that, she joined Dorothy in the hat box. Minnie claimed that her death was the result of a fall, but autopsy results show that it was more likely a case of suffocation. Now, a railway news agent had spotted Minnie getting on a train with a hat box and an infant. But on the return trip, the baby was gone and the hat box was suspiciously more heavy than it should have been, and many people noticed this. And I wondered when I first read this, well, how would they know, right? Like, how would they know just by looking at it? But as I watched some TV shows and things about it, it was clear that she had been carrying it herself and quite obviously struggling with the weight of it. And also, as she'd boarded the train, she'd given the hat box and her luggage to the train conductor so she could step on, and he'd taken it. So there were a few people who would have actually witnessed her struggling with the weight and also have felt it for themselves and understood that that is not normal. So this information about Minnie having a baby and then not having a baby was passed on to the police. They traced the baby back to Jane Hornsby, who was the grandmother of 1-month-old little Eva. She said that she had handed the infant over to Minnie Dean at the Clarendon station. The police took Jane to the Larches, where she found items of Eva's clothes, but obviously no sign of Eva. At this time, Minnie Dean was immediately arrested by the police. She was charged with infanticide and sent to the Dunedin Women's Prison to await trial, even though at this stage they had no body. So the police launched a massive search of the railway line, thinking that maybe Minnie had disposed of the body somewhere along the journey, which honestly would probably make quite a lot of sense. But they turned up empty, so they decided to direct their efforts towards Minnie's own garden, which she really loved and doted on apparently. As they did this, sadly, they discovered the very freshly buried bodies of Dorothy and Eva. They also found the skeleton of a boy called Willie, who was the 4-year-old boy that Minnie claimed had drowned years earlier. Obviously, Minnie Dean had been publicly branded as a murderer, and the community absolutely hated her. And further inquiry revealed that Charles Dean, Minnie's husband, had been expressly forbidden from going near Minnie's garden, even to pluck out stray weeds. And Charles was ultimately let go without charge in this case. It seemed that he was a bit of an incompetent buffoon and quite an alcoholic, but the police couldn't really find any evidence to suggest he had played an active role in Minnie's unfortunate events. Now, although 3 bodies had been found, Minnie was only made to face charges of the death of little Dorothy. Minnie's trial began before the Invercargill Supreme Court on June 18th, 1895. And there was a media frenzy. This was like the most exciting thing to have happened to Southland forever, pretty much. And here is the most disturbing thing, and like obviously this whole story is really sad and disturbing, but people, the locals outside the courthouse were selling souvenirs, and this is so messed up. They were selling souvenirs of little babies inside hat boxes, like little baby dolls inside hat boxes. I mean, when I heard that, I could not believe it. I thought it was so abhorrent and disgusting, you know, like, ugh, just awful. Minnie was presented as a murdering monster at a time where there was a real groundswell of opinion over baby farming in general. A succession of witnesses described how Minnie had collected Dorothy on the 30th of April from Bluff, returned to Winton for 2 nights before leaving with the child in an empty hatbox. By the time she collected Eva Hornsby from Clarendon, little Dorothy had disappeared and Minnie's hatbox was suspiciously heavy. When she returned to Winton, she had with her only a few parcels and a suspiciously heavy hatbox. And here's where it gets interesting, because under cross-examination, the woman who had handed Dorothy over to Minnie Dean said that although an agreement had been made, Minnie had not received any payment for Dorothy yet. Which is quite interesting, right? Because if she had murdered this child for financial gain and she was just a means to an end, why would she kill Dorothy before she received any form of payment? Minnie Dean was represented by a lawyer who's become quite famous in New Zealand, Alfred Hansen. He argued that all the deaths were accidental and that Minnie had simply covered them up to help prevent another massive scandal and public scrutiny like she had done in the past. And sadly, Minnie definitely did not get a fair trial, right? Her trial was held in Invercargill, where the crimes had taken place. Everybody knew who she was. They'd known about her for years. The jury was already very prejudiced about her. And despite the defense's best efforts to try and avoid having any evidence about Eva being put forward in the case, it was pretty clear that the jury was biased against her to begin with. And Hanlon did a damn good job at trying to plant a seed of reasonable doubt about Minnie. He argued that if she had intended to kill these two babies and get away with it, why the heck would she bury them in her front garden? There were multiple opportunities to dispose of the bodies along the train ride, including in heaps of many different lakes, rivers, streams. She could easily have done that and they would never ever have been found. She even had swamps and acres of farmlands on her own property that she could have disposed of them in. Hanlon suggests that her actions point to, rather than her being a cold-blooded killer, that Minnie was actually terrified and didn't know what to do. So she disposed of the bodies hastily in her garden that she loved when she arrived home. He also raised the point that because Minnie hadn't received payment for Dorothy, it didn't make sense for her to kill her. Hanlon delivered a very powerful closing argument. It was so powerful, in fact, that the prosecution delayed the end of the trial for 2 days because they were really worried that he had won the jury over. But it ultimately made no difference because on the 21st of June 1895, after deliberating for just 30 minutes, Minnie Dean was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. Hanlon appealed on the grounds of inadmissible evidence, but he was ultimately unsuccessful. Now, at the time, there had been a few other women who had been sentenced to death in New Zealand, but all of their sentences were commuted to either life without parole or an extended period in jail. So Minnie was the first woman ever to be executed in New Zealand's history, and the only woman to this day. On the morning of August 12th, 1985, Minnie Dean was hanged in Invercargill. The Otago Daily Times covered her execution after she was led from her cell on that day. Quote, "She walked straight on without a halt to the drop pour, gave a scrutinizing glance, first at the gallows and its belongings, then at the half-dozen people standing below, a contemptuous, loathing look at the hangman, and placed herself in a position to facilitate his work as much as possible, and took a few long breaths while he was adjusting the rope and placing the white calico cap over her head and face. A crowd swarmed outside the prison walls, even though nothing could be seen or heard. The sheriff asked whether she had any final words. 'No,' said Dean, 'except that I am innocent.' As she fell through the trap door, newspapers reported that she cried out, 'Oh God, let me not suffer,' unquote." Minnie Dean is buried in Winton Cemetery alongside her husband, who died in a house fire in 1908 at age 73. Minnie never took the witness stand at her trial, but while awaiting execution, she wrote a massive document outlining her activities. She stated that in addition to Margaret Cameron and Esther Wallace, the two children that the Deans had originally adopted, 26 children, including Eva Hornsby and Dorothy Edith Carter, had passed through her hands from 1889 to 1895. 6 are known to have died, 1 is known to have been reclaimed by their family, 5 healthy and well cared for children were living at the Larches at the time of her arrest, and the fate of the other children remains unknown. Minnie claims that 7 of the children were adopted by families who wished to remain unknown. The police and the public, however, believe that those 7 children were murdered. And it is possible that some of those children may have died either by illness or accident, and Minnie may have disposed of them secretly again to avoid public scrutiny, but I guess we'll never know. And in response to the concern around child protection following the case of Minnie Dean, the Infant Protection Act 1893 was revised and strengthened in 1896. So Minnie Dean became the only woman to be hanged or executed full stop for her crimes in New Zealand history. And many convicted New Zealand murderers have passed from notoriety to obscurity since then, but for whatever reason, the legend of Minnie Dean lives on. She became not only the stuff of legends, but nightmares in Southland. Can you believe that parents used to threaten their children that they would send them to Minnie Dean if they misbehaved? I just think that's weird personally. I wouldn't do that. A Southland wildflower was named Minnie Dean, as locals believed it should be torn out and burnt if it appeared in the garden. It was the same flower that was found growing over the bodies of the children at the Larches. So that's pretty much the story of Minnie Dean. I think when I first really started looking into it, I really expected to learn worse things about her. I thought, based on the legend, based on what people would say about her, that she really would have, you know, committed some horrific acts. And obviously the way that these poor babies lived and died is very sad. But I get the distinct impression that she was just kind of negligent and incompetent rather than malicious in her care of these children. Marlon Williams, a New Zealand singer-songwriter, wrote a song called The Ballad of Minnie Dean, which I will link to because I can't play it. And I thought he did a really great job of that. I think by today's standards, people are looking at the Minnie Dean case through a slightly different lens. I do not believe that she would have been found guilty today of infanticide, that is. I definitely think that she wasn't innocent, you know. She certainly shouldn't have been looking after that many children, and that is negligent. Like, if you've got too many kids in your care that you know you cannot care for properly, disposing of bodies is terrible. You know, I mean, obviously she's not great. Let's be honest, she's not a great person. It's an all-round shit show. But was she a cold-blooded killer? I don't think so, personally. I get a lot of stick, I think, for sometimes looking at things with a different perspective and giving people the benefit of the doubt. But in this case, yeah, I think she had a shit life, terrible background, terrible string of luck. It's just weird. It's like she's cursed or something, honestly. Anyway, what do you think of this case? Please let me know your thoughts down below. Also, let me know if you like hearing about these older cases from the 19th century. If you do, I will make an effort to do more of them. I quite enjoy them. I think they're quite cool. As always, if you have any case suggestions or there's anything you want me to touch on or cover, let me know down below as well. Otherwise, thank you for sticking with me if you're still with me this far, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.